Hi everybody, I'm Taylor Sparks and I'm here with a 3-part video series on how to use Python to make beautiful, effective scientific figures. This is the first video. In this first video, part 1, we're going to talk about what are the exact hallmarks that make a good versus a bad scientific figure. Part 2 will be the basics of how to make some fundamental basic figures in Python. And part 3 is going to be more an advanced class for the more difficult figures that we're going to be talking about today. First off, I'll say that everything that I'm saying is just my opinion, right? And it's my opinion that I've gotten from my PhD advisor, my postdoc advisor, and really clever people like Jean-Luc Doumont. In fact, I would say that if you do nothing else from this talk today, you should check out what they have to say, right? For one thing, a lot of things I'm going to show today are recreated from Seshadri's excellent guide on making figures. You can find a link to that in the description below. Or go to tiny.cc/Dumont, and that will take you to a really great YouTube video of the master himself, Jean-Luc Doumont, who's a fantastic scientific communicator, or you can check out his book, treesmapsandtheorems.com, right? So that said, we're going to be talking about something called graphical excellence today, right? So graphical excellence from Tufte's definition, this is Edward Tufte, another expert in scientific visualization. He calls graphical excellence well-designed, interesting data, right? Further, we could say that an effective figure takes a complicated idea and then finds a way to portray it in clarity, precision, and efficiency. Let's take this figure on the right? Maybe you don't know any of these things, right? This epsilon symbol with the R, or DEDT, or chi, or k-counts, or lattice constants. Maybe you don't know what any of that is. But the point of this figure was to drive home one message. In this work, which came from something that I published a few years back, we were talking about magnetic ordering temperatures. Now, magnetic ordering is tricky. Sometimes the changes are really subtle. And so any one characterization technique that you could employ might only really give a really small signal. And so you might want to measure it with 4 or 5 different approaches, and that's what we did here. What you're seeing are 4 different rectangular boxes, the ones shown here, where each one of these is a different characterization technique. And then what we've shown you is that they're all plotted on the same x-axis, showing temperature, and there were 2 transitions that were well known, right? The one here at like 65 degrees and this one around 30 degrees. Those were known existing temperatures where magnetic ordering occurred in the structure. And what we were trying to argue in this whole paper is that there was a 3rd magnetic transition. We show it here, this one right here, happening at about 20 degrees. And so we're showing that there's slight changes in all of these things, but they all support the same conclusion that something else is going on here, right? So you could show all these different figures separately, but graphical excellence would be one that brings together all the different types of data to make one point. So it doesn't have to be a complex figure. I'm going to show you lots of really simple figures today, which are also great. But if your message in this case was that something's happening and look at all the evidence that's pointing to it, this is just a really nice way to get that point across. Okay, so what are we up against? Well, the default plotting program that many scientists and engineers are using is Excel, right? And even if it's not Excel, if it's other things, oftentimes some of these default programs really make surprisingly bad plots. And they've gotten better over time. They used to be a lot worse, but they're still not great. For example, if I put in some data from a recent publication that I've been working on, and I put it in Excel and I just said, make a plot, this is what it gives me. So what do we think about this? First off, I've plotted it 5 inches wide, which is pretty big, okay? Some things that come to mind, like why on earth are we using space for this chart title up top, right? When do you typically need to have a chart title? Because almost all figures that you're going to have in scientific publications are going to have a figure caption below. So it's rare that you really need a title. What else? Well, it chose to put this legend way off to the side. So now we've got all this wasted white space, right? And instead we've sort of crammed our actual figure into 2/3 or half of the size that was available, right? You have to wonder, where are the x-axis tick marks? They didn't show up. It's difficult to see these different data points because they're all circulars first off, and then when they get clumped together down at this end, it's hard to tell where the individual data points are, and maybe that's important. The font size is irregular. The X label formatting is bad. They just did this 1.00e to the +00, right? There's just better ways to format this, and like, do we really have that many significant figures, or is that just what it chose to plot here? I think that these colors are okay, but unimaginative. The markers and the line stroke are uniform when they could be used to differentiate your data sets, right? You could have circles and triangles and squares or whatever you want to show that they're different, right? Now, as bad as this is, it gets worse, right? Because a publication looks like this. When you take a publication, almost always in scientific literature, we're dealing with two-column format. Two-column format means that you're writing your text and you talk about your figure over here, right here about the figure over there, right? And so your figure gets squished, right? If the full page is 8.5 inches, this area for your figure is no longer 5 inches, it's 3.5 inches. So it got a lot smaller. So right off the bat, a square figure is going to give you more real estate to work with, right? Because it can be, if it's taller, that gives you more reason to work with for the same width. Now, most figures in scientific publications from like Excel or whatever else, the default is to make landscape plots. But what that does is it's going to make this a lot shorter. You're going to have this really small box here to work with as opposed to this nice box by making it roughly square, okay? So we take this one, we shrink it down to 3.5 inches. Notice how much harder it is to read? It's getting much harder to read. We're really losing out by not taking advantage of the full palette of space available. So that's an example of what I think is a fairly bad plot, which came by default out of the plotting software that you probably have been using. Now, let's take an example on the other hand of a nice figure, right? Here's one that I made using Python, which we're going to learn how to do in the next 2 videos, right? Here you can see some big differences. First off, we didn't put a chart title up here because it didn't need it, right? What's that going to say there that we can't just put in the caption, right? So why waste valuable space? The legend is inside the plot area, right? By putting it inside here, we don't have to have it off the side. Therefore, the whole thing can be bigger and much easier to read. The ticks are uniform on both axes, right? This separation from one tick to the other as we go along this way is roughly the same as that on the y-axis, which is just appealing to the eye, right? The font size is uniform throughout. The font label, the axes labels, the tick labels, the axes labels, and the legend are all the same font, and those should be close to the same font as the text, right? In your text, you want this font here on these to be roughly the same size as your text. You want it to be much bigger or much smaller, right? So this looks pretty good there. We have x-axis labeling formatting is really great, like 10 to the 0, 10 to the 1, 10 to the 2. It just looks much better than our previous one, right? The colors I think are beautiful. That's a little bit subjective. We'll talk about color in a minute. And then the markers are unique to each data set. One thing I could have done is I could have done solid line, dashed line, dotted line, right? I could have added some additional ways to differentiate the data, which it looks like I didn't do in this figure, but that would have made it even better, I think. Okay. By the way, when we shrink this down from 5 inches to 3.5 inches, where it's going to fit on a paper, you can still read it. It's still really nice, right? Let's compare these two side by side, right? So this is in 3.5 inches wide. Here's the Excel output, and here's this output. Which one is easier to read? Which one's going to be more clear where the actual data points are? Notice how I did white fill, and then I did a stroke color, so you can actually see the individual data points on these, whereas here it's much harder to see where the individual data points are. If you wanted to read a value off, these tick marks are going to make it much easier than what you've got down there. So it's just better, I think. Might have your own opinion, but I think it's a lot better. So let's talk about color for a minute. What is something that makes it a good choice when it comes to color? Well, we want a few things. We want it to make it easier for the viewer to view and interpret the data. We want to draw attention to the appropriate parts of the data, and we want to make it accessible to all viewers, all while making it aesthetically pleasing and beautiful, right? So when it comes to colors, you've got lots and lots and lots of options. And fortunately nowadays, it's never been easier to pick good colors. For example, you could go right now to colorbrewer2.org, right? And they make color selection very simple. You go here, you click the number of data sets that you're working with. Like for example, here we were working with 3. So I could have come here and selected 3. And then you can talk about your data. Is it sequential, diverging, or qualitative? What's the difference, right? Let's say we're talking about sequential. That might be like total population, right? So you could have states that don't have very many people or states with a lot, so it's a sequence. But diverging, the one that you typically see there, the example is temperature, right? So maybe there's like an average temperature, and on any given day, what you're showing is deviation, either above or below that average temperature. So a sequential versus a diverging color palette are going to look different. And then there's qualitative. Let's go ahead and take a look at this on her website. All right, coming here to colorbrewer2.org, let's take a look at these. Let's assume that we have a data set with 5 different data points, right? So here's sequential. You can see that she gives you lots of options for these different colors, which are sequential in nature. But let's say that our data was diverging, where you have like an average and then you're going above or below that, so you're diverging. Take a look at these. Here you can see very clearly that you have, diverging from your average values. So these are lots of great options, but then they give you other really cool things. So qualitative, obviously, is just like, doesn't matter. There's no rhyme or reason to the data. You just want to show it nicely in a bunch of different colors. Here she shows you a bunch of different ones. Something cool that you can do is you can click this color blind safe box, and you can see if there's any that match your criteria, right? Let's come back over here to sequential and then hit colorblind safe, where we only want to pick some that are going to be colorblind safe, and all of these are going to be okay, right? So that's all of a sudden really helpful. You can talk about print friendly. It'll show you what it looks like if you tried to print it or photocopy it, right? And so you can make sure that you're picking something that's going to work well for you. I think that's really awesome. Maybe the best part about this though is you can go here to this export, and this is so awesome. It takes these colors. Let's say you like this color palette, right? You literally hit this export button. It says, you know, here you go. If you're going to be doing something in Python, you can just grab these, and that is now a JavaScript array. It's going to work as well for Python. You can grab that, copy it, and paste it right into Python. So we'll show you an example of that in our next video when we do some basic plots. But this is a really great place to start for picking colors. But it's not the only place. There's lots of other great options. For example, another great option is to use the seaborn library in Python. We'll show you that library in our next videos, but it has some really great things. They've done a really good job of picking colors which are equally distant from one another using this circular approach of things that your eye doesn't pay attention to one much more than the others. That's the idea behind it, is that these should be equally important to you. Whereas if you have something that's really bright and something that's really dark, sometimes your more eye goes to one or the other. And then they have lots of different versions of it. You can get it pastel or deep or muted, colorblind friendly, bright, dark. It has loads of options. I don't typically use these ones as much. Instead, I use from the Seaborn palette, I use their specific color palettes like the Rocket palette or Mako or the Cube Helix palettes. I think that these make some really good figures, and I'll show you some in just a moment. But the point is that it's never been easier to pick good colors, and there's not really an excuse to use bad colors anymore. So pick a palette you like and run with it. If you don't know what you like, look at some good publications. Look at what gets published in the journals that you like to read, the figures that catch your eye, and then copy them. It's the best version of flattery, is, you know, start using what they use, okay? Let's talk for a minute about insets. Insets are when you put this plot inside of your plot. And I'll say that usually these are pretty poorly done, because what do? Usually is you make one figure in Excel, you make another figure in Excel, you then shrink that one, you drop it on top of it, right? That's what most folks will do. And the problem with that is that, first off, we were lucky in this figure in that we had like a pretty big chunk of our plot that didn't have any data, and so it was pretty easy to just to drop it on there. We had white space to do it. That's not always going to be the case for sure. Then the other problem is that when you shrink it, now you have this irregularity between your font size. This is no longer the same as that. It's gotten shrunk. Fortunately, in this case, you can still read it pretty easily, but remember, we're still looking at it in 5 inches, right? When you shrink it down to 3.5, it gets harder to read. This stuff gets pretty little. And I hate to say it, but this is a figure from one of my own papers. This is my very first paper in grad school. This figure came from it. And at least you can still read it, but in hindsight, I would have done it differently. Now, how can you do it differently? Well, you can make the inset and just make sure that the size is the exact same font. That would be a minimum that you could do. Make sure you can still read your data points. But I'm going to show you a really great tip that Excel cannot do, but Python can do, and it's called a multi-panel plot. But before I do that, let me show you another example where really we would benefit from doing a multi-panel plot. So how about this one? Here you're seeing X and Y. We don't have them labeled, but you're seeing two different data sets, these blue circles and these orange squares. Those are actually circles as well, so that's not very good. That's really not good. They're the same data, right? That's going to be hard to read. So you have the same data points, the same fill. It's going to be hard to differentiate for somebody that's colorblind maybe. But even more troubling is that the blue data points, you can at least tell that there's like this trend going upwards, but the orange looks basically flat. Okay? So one thing that we could do is we could do a multi-panel plot. And this, of course, gets worse in a 2-column format. But we can make this better with a multi-panel plot. So here's what it might look like. In a multi-panel plot, here's what we do. It's still overall a nice square figure, which lets us shrink nicely into a 2-column format. But go ahead and look at this. You've got data set 1 over here plotted, and data set 2 plotted separately, so they're not on top of each other. We've got much nicer error bars. This one is now a square, while that's a circle, so it's easier to tell them apart. And we adjusted the scale of this one separately from that one while maintaining the same X scale, right? Which makes it really easier to see that they both have trends with respect to X. Just one is more pronounced than the other. It's a stronger effect, right? And that's going to shrink nicely. So these multi-panel plots are a great way to deal with things where you would normally use an inset. I think you should start considering using multi-panel plots, and we'll have those in our next video. What else can we talk about? Well, another type of figure that's really common for scientific publication is a micrograph, maybe taken with actually a photograph or a microscope or an electron microscope. Doesn't matter. These are very common in literature, oftentimes because material science is the study of how we relate structure to properties, and the structure might be the microstructure, right? So if you take this figure taken from Eric Tober's paper, here they show a very typical SEM image, right? You've got this stuff sort of at the bottom. You see that it says that accelerating V, that's it for accelerating voltage, is 4 kilovolts. The spot size, the magnitude, the working distance, and then this really thin little white bar with the 5 microns by it. This is problematic for a couple reasons. First off, it's adding a bunch of information that the viewer really doesn't need to know. Unless your paper is about the details of microscopy, you probably don't need to be telling them your accelerating voltage and spot size and all that jazz. Instead, what they do need to know is one of the hardest things to read here, and that's your scale bar. What I really want to know is how big are these little microstructural features, probably. Are they a micron? Are they 10 microns? What are they? I don't know, because it's hard to see this thin little scale bar, right? So what I propose you do is do some editing on your micrographs as well, which is really easy to do. Just open it up in your image editor of choice, hopefully something like Adobe Illustrator, but open it up, cut out the stuff you don't care about, draw your own scale bar. You need to be careful that you draw it accurately. You can't misrepresent your data, so you have to be really careful that it's the exact same size, but make it really easy to read. Here now it's very obvious that this scale bar is here and that it's 5 microns large, so it makes it really easy to see how big these features are in your data. And I've cut out the stuff that the audience doesn't really need to care about, right? So I think that's something you should consider with your micrographs. All right, now with that said, we've covered some basics of what make good figures. Let's look at some examples. This is the one that we started out with. Again, take a look at it now with the eyes having gone through the steps, right? You see all your data points here. Here, where it's a model and it's not actual data points, you can represent those with a solid line, but anytime you have to have data, I represent using it with a data point. And again, I like to use a white fill with a colored stroke so you can see the individual data points so you know where it's sparse and where it's dense. I like to pick a color palette and stick with it. Like here they went with this nice blue and orange, which are beautiful complementary colors that look really good together. They made sure that it's obvious which side by putting this arrow that this orange corresponds to this axis, but the blue would correspond to the other. They've done a really good job of laying all these out. It's just a beautiful figure. And then again, drawing something like these dashed lines through it really draws your eye right to the right points of the plot that they're trying to make their point around with this paper. All right. Here's another one. This came from a paper that we recently published. In this paper, the whole point of this figure in this paper was to show that, hey, in regions of economic turmoil, like in a civil war, which ended in the year 2003, so in the period prior, something was going on, right? This country, the Congo, the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, had a civil war going on in this period, and during that period their market share of cobalt production was depressed because their neighbor Zambia was actually taking advantage and using some of their mines. So this was in the literature. We were just showing it with the data, and you can see it really clearly. Granted, there's of course a bunch of different countries shown here which all produce cobalt, but the big ones are Congo and Zambia, and you can see really clearly by us choosing to put them at the endpoints of this fill plot how when the war ends, Congo can ramp up their production again, and Zambia loses their market fraction because Zambia had taken it over during the war, which was the whole point of showing this figure, right? So again, it's a nice color palette that we took from the seaborn color palette, where it's a nice sequential data, right? Where we don't care as much about the things in the middle because they're not changing, but these two end members are the ones that are changing, and the way we plot them makes it really easy to see that. How about this one? Heat maps are really important for lots of data in science because it's a really effective way to show dense data. Lots of information is enclosed in a heat map. So something that we did here is we show the heat map. So this is a diffraction data. Notice that the font size is large over throughout. It's really easy to see everything. We've labeled the different phases of interest with these different markers so you can see how they change with respect to pressure. And speaking of pressure, since these are plotted against pressure, we've gone through and we've actually calculated the volume of the unit cell and shown how those change with pressure, since that's one of the key things you take away from these plots. Okay, how about another one? Some fields have conventions of having really busy figures. In the battery field, it is fairly common to see busy figures like this, where you're showing the capacity of your battery plotted against cycle. But not just capacity, you also want to see Coulombic efficiency. And you also want to see energy density, right? So now you've got 3 different axes to deal with. It's possible to do. There's better and worse ways to do it. Here we've tried to map color to the different things, right? So we've got this light teal, right? The teal color maps to energy density. The dark blue corresponds to the capacity. The red up here is for Coulombic efficiency. Again, I would choose to separate these, but if that's how the field does it, you can still try and have large font that everything's very easy to read and try and make it easy to differentiate by using different marker types. Here I've done a little bit of transparency on the markers so you can see when they're piled up on each other, you can still kind of see what's going on. That's I think a good example of that. How about this one? In the world of machine learning, these type of plots are really common. They're called parity plots, and it's always like your predicted value against the actual value. And so a perfect model would have like this nice, all your data would be on this dotted line. And in the real world, it never is. There's always something else. So here we're showing what it should be with the dotted line. The solid line shows what it actually is. And then because your data is all on top of each other and there's lots of overlap, we've started putting these histograms off to the side that show you just how dense are the data points here, right? Because right now when they're all just on top of each other, you don't know how dense that is. By putting the histograms off to the side that represent how clumped your data is, it makes it much easier to assess how the model's doing, okay? What else can we show you? How about this really nice microscopy image that came from my friends at UCSB? Jason Douglas put this figure together, and Nisha Verma, I think, took the images on the FTM. Really great example here. Here they were trying to show that the way that they made their material resulted in a hierarchical structure where you had different things happening at different length scales. At the way zoomed out length scale, that's this one over here, the panel A. Here you can see the scale bar is 100 nanometers, and you've got this sort of checkerboard-ish type of pattern. And then if you zoom in further at the 50 nanometer scale, so now you're seeing what these dark and lighter regions are. They've labeled them HH and FH, and in the figure caption you better believe that they describe what does HH and FH stand for. And then on this one down here, they've zoomed in on just one of these and they've shown you the selected area diffraction. So I love this because it would have been really easy and common for you to just simply take and put three figures, right? Maybe not next to each other, just three figures in the paper somewhere where you talk about these same things. But here, by condensing it into one image, they get the point across that, hey, in this material, there's hierarchical changes happening that change with length scale, and they're pointing to those in a really effective, nice, and square figure, right? Because of the way they've cropped it, which is, I think, just a great job. How about this one? This is from a paper that I did where we had our actual data, and then we were building models based on the actual data. Whenever you build models, I don't think that you should show data points. Data points are for something you measured. Here it's models that use those data points, so I'm using lines, right? But to represent the three different models, the two from other people, Wu and Mason and Koshibe, right, we used purple and green and different types of stroke. Here you've got a regular dashed versus a dash dot dot, right? And then you have our work, which we use the solid line for, right? And then to illustrate that our model was correct, we said, hey, in this region over here, this would only be possible if, in this case, oxygen vacancies were present. And in this example, that didn't look likely. And so our model was the one that worked over the range of thermal power values possible, right? So just be thoughtful about how you can show your data and think about the viewer who's trying to interpret it. By showing this as sort of grayed out, you automatically know that something's going on with this portion of the plot, right? And so you can show this in redundant ways, right? How about this one? This is another example of a heat map. Here's something where we heated up when we were taking Raman spectroscopy measurements. And instead of just showing the heat map, what we did is we, at specific temperatures, we pulled out what the, at this line of temperature, what does the signature actually look like? You can see now really clearly, right? When you see this blue, then light blue, blue, light blue, light blue, light blue, that corresponds to these peaks, right? We're showing you what these peaks are in 2D. So by doing this, it gives you a more complete picture of what's going on while still showing you the overall as well, okay? What else can we show you? I think the last one I'll show you for today is X-ray diffraction patterns. One of the certainly most common types of figures that you'll see in scientific communications are diffraction patterns, certainly material science. And I think this is a good figure. It shows you that the y-axis is intensity with arbitrary units, right? Diffraction doesn't matter what the units are, so it's just intensity and it's arbitrary, and we tell you so. The x-axis is our 2 theta value. We've got nice tick marks that make it easy to read the positions of these peaks. Like this one right here, we can pretty easily read that is, well, if that's 60 and 80, that's 70, so that must be at 65. It makes it really easy to read those. Since this is a Rietveld refinement, that means that you're fitting a model to your data. So I'm showing the data points with these markers, right? That's these circles are. And then I'm fitting the model with a solid line, right? So the theory is like the orange line, that's my Rietveld fit. And I'm showing you with light blue where the sample holder was, meaning we ignored those peaks because it was the sample, and we're only fitting these nice orange ones. With the solid gray line, we're showing you the difference curve down here. We're telling you what the fit value was, that we got the weighted residual down to 5%, which is good. We're telling you what the two phases are that are present, because there's two phases. We're saying that one came out to 48% and one was 60%, because that's what these plots give you. And then just in case you wanted to know which peak corresponds to which peak, we did these nice histogram plots up top, which show you the cobalt oxide and cobalt 304 oxide, so you can know that, oh, okay, this peak over here which they were looking at, that corresponds to the spinel phase, whereas this main peak right here might correspond to the rock salt or something like that. Okay, so I think that this is just a much more effective way of making a diffraction figure. So these are some of the hallmarks of what I think make good versus bad figures. Now let's turn our attention to our next video, which now that we tell you, what makes a good figure, let's dive into how to make those figures.